This Groove tool demo shows how to edit graphs and rules. In this demo, I'll assume you are familiar with the basic functionality of Groove as shown in another demo. This is the main screen of the Groove simulator. At the moment, everything is disabled because we have no open grammar, so I will create a grammar. I want to model a circular buffer. I'll call the grammar circular. The grammar does not yet have any rules, nor does it have a start state. I'll create the start state first by selecting New Graph. Groove expects the default start state to be called Start, so that's the name I'll use. Graphs and rules can always be renamed later. The graph name now appears in the state overview, and on the main display, the Graph tab opens a new editor. Note the bottom row of tabs, which lists all open editors. This currently consists only of the start graph. The editor has a light yellow background to remind you that you are in editing mode. To the right you see two smaller panels. The top one shows all labels currently occurring in the graph. The bottom panel is a list of all the label modifiers applicable to the current graph. This is by way of runtime help. We'll see some of the modifiers being used in this demo, but most of them have to do with more advanced features and appear in other demos. I'll now start constructing my start graph. I want a circular buffer consisting of 4 cells arranged in a cycle. Nodes are created by double-clicking. You immediately get a chance to enter a node label. Multi-line editing is available by using Shift-Enter or Alt-Enter. I'm using type labels to distinguish the nodes and another label for the cell nodes to indicate that they are currently empty. Copy pasting is available as usual, either through Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, or by using the toolbar buttons. You can drag nodes with the mouse or copy by simultaneously pressing the Ctrl key. To model the logical cyclic structure of the buffer, I'll connect the cell nodes with edges. An edge is added by left-clicking the source node, moving the mouse to the target node, and left-clicking again. Once more, you immediately get the chance to enter a label. Edges must always be labeled. If you make a mistake, undo and redo are always available, either through Ctrl+Z and Ctrl+Y, as usual, or through the toolbar buttons. Furthermore, you can save the graph at any point. Both the entry in the state overview, as well as the label on the bottom tab, currently show that the editor is dirty, meaning that there are unsaved edits. Saving, either through Ctrl+S or through the toolbar button, gets rid of this indicator. Finally, we need to distinguish the first and last cells of the buffer. The first cell is where the oldest element is stored, and the last contains the latest element. Currently all cells are empty, and for that reason the last has to point to the cell directly before the first. At any moment you can re-layout the graph using one of the built-in layouters. For this graph this is not particularly useful, but for larger graphs it can be quite handy. I have now finished creating the start graph and can leave the editor using the toolbar button or the tab label. If the editor is still dirty, I get a chance to save it or continue editing. Note that the view changes. The toolbar and runtime help have disappeared, the background color has changed to ordinary white, and the icons in the state overview and the tab label have changed. The next step is to create rules to manipulate the buffer. For this purpose, I select New Rule and enter an appropriate name. The top tab of the main display shows that I am editing a rule. The Runtime Help panel has changed accordingly and now shows a good deal more modifiers. Relevant ones at present are del, new and not. I'm going to create a rule to insert a new element into the buffer. This means that the last cell will shift and the new last receives a new object. Shifting means deleting the last edge and creating a new one pointing to the next cell. The del modifier indicates deletion, turning the edge into an eraser, and new indicates creation. There's a mandatory colon following the modifier without surrounding spaces. Creating a node is different from creating an edge. The new modifier is still used, but now it appears on a line on its own. Do not forget the trailing colon. If I had by mistake prepended the modifier to the object label, this would have had a very different meaning. This does not create an object node, but adds an object label to an existing node. I'll undo. A new edge from the last cell to the object models the fact that the cell contains the object. The new modifier is optional in this case, as the fact that the object node itself is the creator implies that the edge must be created as well. But wait, the object should only be added if the last cell does not already contain one. For this purpose I had introduced the empty label. The new last cell must have been empty in order to admit the rule, but afterwards it is no longer empty. Thus the empty flag is erased from the node, but the node itself remains. You can in fact use auto-completion when entering labels. Pressing Ctrl space after a few letters will cycle through the available labels starting with those letters. This goes both for modifiers and for the labels themselves. As an alternative, I might have chosen to use an embargo instead of the empty label to check for availability of the last cell. For this purpose, I want to ensure that there is not already an object node connected to the last cell. The appropriate modifier is not. Since I want to state the absence of the object node, it is part of the embargo and should again get its own modifier on a separate line. After saving the rule, I can start on the dual rule get that retrieves an object. Note that there are now two rule editors open as the bottom tab row shows, the one for put and the new one for get. In order to retrieve an object from the buffer, I should modify the first cell rather than the last. Otherwise, the rule is very much like the previous one. If I want to use empty labels to check the availability of cells rather than the embargo, I should now add the label. The rule system is now ready for use. I can select matches and apply rules. More about this is shown in the basic functionality demo. Here I want to show one more thing, namely the use of node types and flags. For this purpose, let's first go back to the start graph. You can start editing again either by selecting the Edit button or by double-clicking the main display. I can simply add a type modifier in front of the node type label. As you see, this sets the node type in bold, visually distinguishing it and improving the readability of the graph. In a similar vein, the empty label is actually special since it is intended only for nodes and not for edges. This can be made explicit by adding a flag modifier in front. Flags are set in italic font. If I now save the graph again, the rules do not match anymore. This is because the rules have not been updated accordingly. This can quickly become tedious. Fortunately, Groove allows to replace labels simultaneously. Select the Replace Label action from the Edit menu or from the context menu in the central display. This affects all rules and graphs. For instance, the get rule is also changed. The same principle applies to flags. As you can see, the start state has also been updated. As a final feature, there is also undo and redo functionality available one level up for entire save and relabel actions. I have shown you how to create and edit graphs and rules in Groove using creators, erasers and embargoes. I've also taught you about node types and flags. You can now start creating your own grammars. Groove away!